Um, so our topic is New York City and the environment. And what we want to focus on is changing environmental policies in New York City. So we're advocating for a cleaner New York. Tackling the climate crisis is a large task which requires the city to change its policies and incentivize a more substantial use of Earth's resources. We may begin to address this crisis by researching the carbon emissions, the efficiency of New York City's electric grid, and green roofs.
The reduction of carbon emissions for the health of New York City. I will be looking into the health burdens of poor air quality, which communities suffer, and how is New York City responding to this threat, and can a carbon tax be a viable solution? The health impacts of poor air quality, which have been linked to NO2 and PM 2.5, which are released when burning fossil fuels, are cardiovascular disease, asthma, lung cancer, breast cancer, and premature deaths. The WHO attributes 7 million deaths per year due to poor air quality. The health burden from air quality is disproportionate in the fact that most of the emissions come from the wealthiest parts of New York City, whereas most of the burden falls upon the poorer communities of New York City, as seen in these graphs. And how has New York City responded to this burden thus far? The city has implemented tax benefits for households and companies who switch to sustainable energy. However, they have no restrictions or incentives to restrict high particulate matter and NO2 emissions, which come from vehicular exhaust. The MTA system is subject to its own environmental policies, which help mitigate these emissions, yet the city lacks an incentive to utilize this clean transportation rather than use vehicles, which are under no such restrictions. Can a carbon tax work for us? A carbon tax would work to even the discrepancy between neighborhoods which are responsible for the bulk of emissions and those that suffer the consequences. And multiple case studies, such as this one from British Columbia, show economic growth and emission reduction together.
So another way to improve the energy reduction in New York City is to improve its energy infrastructure. And the larger goal in mind is to reach the state's 80 by 50 clean energy goals, which means to reduce 80% emissions by 2050. First step is transition. So New York State already has a pretty diverse supply of electricity from a number of renewable and non-renewable resources. Those include hydroelectric, solar, wind, natural gas, nuclear, lots of sorts of energy sources. And the aim is to convert these into like the coal, natural gas plants into renewable sources and implement things like offshore wind farms. The next step is to optimize. So to give some context, the big idea here is Hurricane Sandy as a big turning point. New York City had to reconsider the design of its power grid during this time because a lot of calamities took place and it really ruined the infrastructure. So the aim is to decentralize distribution. And we can see in this chart that historically, energy used to flow one way. It used to come from power plants and it will be transmitted and transformed and eventually reach our houses, businesses, and factories. This modernized grid that we're trying to design is a mixture of two-way energy flow and a mixture of all sorts of energy sources, which allow for more flexibility during natural calamities like hurricanes and any sort of disasters that take place. This is a better equipment for New York City's infrastructure. The next thing is to localize, and localize means to really emphasize the power of residents and consumers, having solar at home and understanding the incentives behind it. And a big idea is that buildings should behave as passive houses, which is this perfect synergy because the building is not only efficient, but it's also putting energy back into a grid. And finally, environmental equity, which is this idea that clean energy isn't a privilege, but rather a right, and it's everyone's problem. So how do we address this? We need to be able to regulate third-party energy suppliers that typically scam minority communities or communities that don't speak well English, and start these renewable energy projects in parts where they had a negative impact on minority communities. As you can see from this chart, this relationship between the median annual income and something known as the energy burden, which is basically a percentage of the amount of money paid towards energy costs. And we see that lower income families have a higher energy burden.
So the next thing we looked at was cleaning the air with green roofs. So what are green roofs? Green roofs are basically a rooftop covered with a grassy ground cover. So it's like having a garden on top of your house. So several purposes, green roofs serve several purposes for a building. It absorbs rainwater, it provides insulation and lowers temperature of surrounding air, and it also provides a hangout place for the residents. But most importantly, it purifies the air around the building. So that means you have cleaner air to breathe. So how can the government encourage building owners to install green roofs? The first thing they can do is change in zoning. So buildings account for 70% of greenhouse emissions. And out of those buildings, 40 to 50% of them can have rooftops with green roofs. So the new regulations would allow 8 inches of thickness to exterior walls, which means that they can add another layer to the outside wall. So the building have a better infrastructure to support the green roofs. And another thing is they relaxed height limits for the addition of green roofs. The government can also provide tax breaks. So New York City Department of Buildings provides a $5.23 rebate per square foot of green roof. So every square foot of green roof that's installed, they're going to get $5.23 back. They also can receive a 1-year tax credit of up to $100,000. And then, but in order to qualify for this, the green roof must cover 50% of the building's rooftop of 75% of the eligible rooftop space. And the last thing the government can do is they can lead by example. They can invest more money into projects that would better the environment to make the green roofs more sustainable or cheaper. And they can also install them on government buildings. Once people see the government installing the green roofs, it will give them encouragement to install it on their own buildings.
So, in conclusion, we must admit that climate change affects everyone and therefore is everyone's problem and not just a select few. We are in this all together when the collaboration between government, advocacy groups, scientists, and utility companies is met. So, how can we address climate change in New York City? The reduction of carbon emissions, modernizing New York City's electric grid, and advocating for clean and affordable energy, and implementing green roofs for a safer and cleaner New York City.